A prejudiced officer arrogantly stopped a car and berated a black man, declaring him out of place in the neighborhood. Little did the officer know, the man was Derek Hayes, the newly appointed chief of police. When the truth came to light, the officer was left speechless. This story is more than a tense confrontation. It is a powerful reminder of justice, courage, and the relentless pursuit of equity. Before we dive into this thought-provoking tale, let us know where you're watching from and hit subscribe to ensure you don't miss more inspiring stories like this. Riversedge, a small town nestled among rolling hills, was once admired for its quiet charm and modest way of life. Beneath this serene image, however, lay a complicated and painful past. For decades, Riversedge had been a hotspot of racial tensions, its community deeply scarred by inequality and division. Beneath the surface, struggles over race, class, and authority had left the town fractured. 10 years ago, Riversedge was rocked by a scandal within its police department. Senior officers were exposed for abusing their positions, covering up acts of violence targeting minority residents. Leaked internal reports brought the ugly truth to light, forcing high-ranking officials to resign in disgrace. The scandal ignited protests and shattered the fragile trust between Riversedge's citizens and its justice system. Many came to view the police not as protectors of law and order, but as enforcers of oppression. Amid this turmoil, Derek Hayes emerged as a beacon of hope, a symbol of renewal during a time of profound disillusionment. Derek, a black man, had just been appointed Riversedge's chief of police, the first in the town's history to achieve this role. His appointment signified a bold effort by the administration to rebuild public trust and bring meaningful reform. For Derek, the position was far more than a job. It was a mission deeply rooted in his identity. Having grown up in the poorest neighborhood of Riversedge, Derek had experienced firsthand what it meant to be treated as a second-class citizen. His early years were defined by watching his parents work tirelessly to provide for their family while enduring the indignities of overt discrimination. Derek could still vividly recall a life-changing moment when he was just 10 years old. One evening, his father was pulled over by police officers while driving home. Their only justification? He was a black man behind the wheel of a car they deemed too nice for someone like him. Despite his father explaining that he was a hard-working man who had just received a modest bonus, he was dragged out of the car, interrogated, and humiliated in front of young Derek. Powerless, Derek stood by and watched his father endure this degrading treatment. From that moment, a quiet but fierce determination was born within him, a resolve to dismantle the very system that allowed such injustice to exist. Becoming a police officer was not an easy decision for Derek. He knew the path ahead would be filled with challenges. As one of the few black officers in the force, he faced doubt from both his peers and the community he sought to serve. Yet, through unwavering dedication and a belief in justice, Derek persevered. Over 25 years of service, he built a reputation as a fair, compassionate, and principled leader. Now, at 50 years old, Derek was stepping into the role of chief of police with equal measures of pride and pressure. Every move he made would be closely scrutinized by those longing for change and those rooting for his failure. But Derek was undeterred. He understood that his mission was not just about himself. It was about representing those who had been overlooked and mistreated for far too long. On the morning of his first day as chief, Derek stood before the mirror in his uniform. The badge on his chest gleamed in the sunlight streaming through the window, a potent reminder of his purpose. He whispered to himself, "Today isn't just my day. It's the day of everyone who has ever been overlooked." As Derek drove to the police station, he carried not only his personal aspirations, but also the collective hopes of Riversedge, a town yearning for transformation. The road ahead was steep, but Derek Hayes was ready to guide Riversedge into a new chapter, one where justice and trust could finally take root. "Son, how could I not be nervous?" Derek Hayes replied to his son, Marcus, a composed 17-year-old with the same thoughtful eyes as his father. But pressure isn't always a bad thing. It reminds us that what we're doing matters. Marcus looked at his father for a moment before saying softly, "I just worry that they won't accept you, that what you're trying to change is too much for them." Derek chuckled quietly, though his eyes reflected the weight of Marcus's words. You know, people aren't afraid of change because it's hard, he said. They're afraid of it because it forces them to face their own mistakes. I know some will resist me, but that doesn't mean I'll back down. Marcus hesitated before asking, but what if they refuse to change at all? Derek leaned back, thoughtful. When I was your age, my father used to say, if you can't change the whole world, start with your own corner of it. I can't fix everything in a day, Marcus, but I can lead by example and focus on the things I can control. The two sat in contemplative silence for a moment before Marcus broke it. I'm proud of you, Dad. I really am. Derek smiled warmly, reaching out to ruffle Marcus's hair as he'd done when he was little. Thank you, son. That means more to me than any compliment I'll get today. Before leaving the house, Derek stepped into his modest study. Standing before a worn wooden desk, he closed his eyes and prayed. Lord, I'm not perfect, but I ask for the strength to do what's right, no matter the challenges. Let me remember that this day isn't about me, it's about the people who've been ignored and wronged for too long. Opening his eyes, Derek straightened his uniform, took a deep breath, and stepped outside. His black SUV gleamed under the morning sun, a symbol of his new beginning in Riversedge. Before getting in, he turned back to see Marcus standing in the doorway, waving, his eyes filled with belief in his father. Gripping the steering wheel, Derek drove off, his mind alive with thoughts, plans, and a measure of uncertainty about what lay ahead. He wasn't just preparing to meet his team, he was preparing to face resistance and skepticism. This was his opportunity to start fresh, not just for Riversedge, but for himself as well. As his SUV glided toward downtown Riversedge, the morning sunlight danced through the branches of towering trees. Derek rehearsed the speech he would deliver to his officers. He reminded himself of the importance of first impressions. More than anything, he wanted to be seen not only as a leader, but as someone who acted with conviction and integrity. His thoughts were interrupted by the wail of a siren and the flash of red and blue lights in his rearview mirror. Derek frowned, puzzled, but remained calm. He knew he hadn't broken any traffic laws. Slowly, he pulled to the side of the road, carefully placing his hands on the steering wheel. From the patrol car behind him, a heavy-set, middle-aged officer stepped out. Officer Alan Kirk, notorious within the Riversedge Police Department for his abrasive attitude, approached the SUV. His demeanor was cold, and his faded uniform reflected years of wear and neglect. Kirk's eyes shifted from suspicion to disdain as he saw Derek, a black man, behind the wheel of a sleek SUV. This car doesn't look like something you should be driving, Kirk said gruffly. License and registration. Derek looked up, his expression calm yet unyielding. I don't believe I've broken any laws, officer. Is there a problem? Kirk smirked, his tone dripping with condescension. Don't ask questions. Just hand over your papers. Derek took a deep breath, reached into the glove compartment, and handed over his documents. Kirk flipped through them carelessly, clearly searching for an excuse to prolong the encounter. Out-of-town plates, Kirk remarked, his voice heavy with insinuation. What brings you to Riversedge? I'm here for work, Derek replied evenly. Work where? Kirk pressed, disbelief creeping into his voice. At the Riversedge Police Department, Derek said, meeting Kirk's gaze without flinching. Kirk let out a mocking laugh, stepping back. You expect me to believe someone like you works at the police department? Don't make me laugh. Derek tightened his grip on the steering wheel as frustration bubbled beneath his composed exterior. Despite the blatant disrespect, he refused to let his emotions get the better of him. I've answered your questions, officer. Unless there's a valid reason for this stop, I believe I'm free to go. Kirk's smirk faded, replaced by a flicker of anger. You don't tell me how to do my job, he snapped. Get out of the car now. Derek Hayes knew that losing his composure would only escalate the situation. Keeping his voice firm but even, he said, I've answered your questions and provided my documentation. Unless you have a legitimate reason, I believe I'm free to go. Officer Alan Kirk's temper flared at Derek's calm defiance. Jabbing a finger toward Derek, he barked, You're telling me how to do my job. Get out of the car, now. Derek remained composed, his voice steady. You have no legal basis for that request. This is an abuse of your authority. Kirk's face turned red with anger, and in a shocking display of escalation, he drew his gun, pointing it directly at Derek. "Out of the car, on your knees right now, or I'll show you who's really in charge here." The atmosphere grew unbearably tense. Derek held Kirk's gaze, his calm resolve unshaken even in the face of the threat. At that moment, a young woman named Lily, walking by on the opposite sidewalk, stopped in her tracks. Quickly assessing the situation, she pulled out her phone and began recording. "I'm filming this," she called out loudly. "You better think twice about what you're doing." Kirk, visibly agitated, glanced at Lily but refused to lower his weapon. "This isn't your business. Move along." Lily held her ground. "No, I'm not leaving. This is misconduct, and I'll make sure everyone knows about it." Realizing the situation was spiraling out of control, Kirk grabbed his radio, his voice sharp and shaky. "I need backup immediately. I've got a suspicious individual here." As the moments dragged on, Kirk's hands trembled, though he kept his weapon trained on Derek. Meanwhile, Derek's voice cut through the tension, low but commanding. "You've made a serious mistake. You have no idea who you're dealing with." Moments later, another patrol car arrived on the scene. Officer Miguel Torres stepped out, immediately recognizing Derek, his face froze in shock. "Kirk, what are you doing?" Torres demanded, his voice tinged with disbelief. "Just handling a suspicious individual," Kirk replied, though his confidence faltered noticeably. Torres turned to Derek and immediately grasped the severity of the situation. "Sir, are you Chief Hayes?" Derek gave a curt nod, his gaze cold. "Yes, I am. And this officer just pulled a gun on me without justification." Torres took a deep breath, clearly unnerved. Turning to Kirk, he said firmly, "Put the gun down, Alan. You're making this worse." Kirk hesitated, beads of sweat forming on his brow. After a long moment, he lowered the weapon. Derek stepped out of his SUV, his imposing presence cutting through the tension. "What's your name, officer?" he asked, though he had already read the badge. "Alan Kirk," the officer muttered, barely audible. Derek's tone sharpened. "I'll see you at the station, Officer Kirk. Be prepared to face the consequences." The street fell silent as Derek's declaration hung in the air. Moments earlier, Kirk had radiated arrogance, but now he stood visibly shaken, his confidence replaced by fear and confusion. His weapon hung limply in his hand, his trembling fingers unsure of what to do next. "You're the chief of police?" Kirk stammered, his voice hoarse, his eyes searching Derek's face for any sign that this might be some misunderstanding. "That's correct," Derek said, his voice low and deliberate. "I'm Derek Hayes, the new chief of police for Riversedge, and you just pointed a gun at me for no legitimate reason, driven by nothing but prejudice and an abuse of power." Kirk stood frozen, his lips moving soundlessly as if searching for words that wouldn't come. Under Derek's unyielding stare, the reality of his actions set in. Derek took a steadying breath and continued, his tone firm and resonant. "Your actions today weren't just a personal insult to me. They've damaged the integrity of the entire Riversedge Police Department. When you aim a weapon at an innocent man without cause, you don't just disgrace yourself, you shatter the fragile trust our community is trying to rebuild." Kirk bit his lip, his hands now visibly shaking. He lowered his head, unable to meet Derek's piercing gaze. Derek wasn't finished. His voice cut through the air like a blade. "Do you think this only affects me? Imagine what the people of Riversedge will think when they learn one of their officers so readily threatened an innocent man. Will they see a force that protects them? Or a system riddled with abuse and unchecked power?" Kirk opened his mouth as if to respond, but Derek raised a hand to silence him. "No, let me finish. If you think I'll overlook this because it's my first day, think again. Let me make one thing clear. The days of excusing misconduct are over. You don't have to like me, but you will respect the badge you wear, and you will respect the law." Lily, still filming from the roadside, didn't speak, but her expression radiated approval. A light breeze rustled the trees, unnoticed by anyone present as all attention remained on the unfolding confrontation. Kirk swallowed hard, his voice barely audible. "Chief, I didn't know," Alan Kirk stammered, his voice trembling. "That's right, you didn't know," Derek Hayes interrupted, his tone weighty with authority. "And that's exactly what concerns me. A police officer who acts without thinking, especially while holding a gun, has no place in this force. Officer Miguel Torres, who had been standing nearby, stepped forward, his expression a mix of concern and embarrassment. "Chief Hayes, I understand how serious this is. I'll escort Kirk back to the station and ensure he provides a full account of his actions." Derek nodded, his gaze unwavering. "Good, and make sure he understands this isn't just a reprimand. This is his final warning." Turning back to Kirk, Derek added, his voice cutting through the tense air like a blade. "This is a lesson for you, Kirk. Power is not a weapon to intimidate or demean others. If you fail to understand that, you have no place in this department. Remember, anyone can be replaced." Kirk lowered his head in silence. Torres gently guided him toward the patrol car, leaving Derek to watch them go. Though he felt a flicker of satisfaction at having resolved the situation without escalation, disappointment lingered in his eyes. Before returning to his SUV, Derek turned to Lily, who was still holding her phone. "Thank you for standing up," he said, his voice softer now. "It's people like you who remind me that Riversedge still has hope." Lily nodded, her warm smile filled with encouragement. "We need people like you, Chief Hayes. Good luck." Derek climbed into his SUV and took a deep breath before driving off. In the rearview mirror, he saw Lily still standing there, phone in hand. He knew the events of that morning would spread quickly, not just across Riversedge, but likely beyond. Change, he reminded himself, often required confronting such challenges head-on. Derek drove to the Riversedge Police Department in a state of intense focus. The events of the morning had been a stark reminder of the uphill battle he faced. As his SUV pulled into the parking lot, he noticed a group of officers gathered near the station's main entrance. Some wore curious expressions, but others bore a mix of wariness and skepticism. Stepping out of his vehicle, Derek scanned the faces watching him. A few offered tentative smiles, while many remained distant. Ignoring the mixed reception, he strode purposefully into the lobby, where small clusters of officers stood silently observing him. He made his way to the briefing podium used for morning announcements, turned to face the room, and addressed the group with a commanding tone. "Gather around," he ordered, firm but calm. Slowly, the officers formed a loose circle, their eyes fixed on their new chief. "Before we begin the day," Derek started, his voice steady, "I need to address something that happened this morning. On my way here, I was stopped by one of our own, Officer Alan Kirk. He detained me without cause, and then drew his weapon on me." The room grew tense as silence settled over the officers. Some exchanged shocked glances, while others shifted uncomfortably. "This isn't personal," Derek continued, his tone firm. "It doesn't matter that it was me. What matters is that this kind of behavior is completely unacceptable toward anyone. No officer has the right to abuse their authority or act out of prejudice." A scoff broke the silence from the back of the room. John Manning, a seasoned officer with over 20 years on the force, stepped forward, his arms crossed. His demeanor was challenging. "With all due respect, Chief," Manning said, his tone skeptical, "don't you think this should have been handled internally? Suspending a veteran officer like Kirk without considering his record could hurt morale." Derek turned to face Manning directly, his gaze cold yet composed. "Morale?" he repeated, his tone sharp. "I think morale suffers far more when one of us uses their badge to intimidate others. That doesn't just reflect poorly on Kirk, it reflects poorly on all of us." Manning raised an eyebrow but said nothing, seemingly taken aback. Derek pressed on, his voice growing firmer. "This isn't about personal grievances or politics. It's about accountability and integrity. If we can't hold ourselves to the highest standards, how can we expect the community to trust us?" A few officers nodded in quiet agreement, though murmurs of dissent still lingered. Derek took note of the reactions, understanding that trust would take time to earn. "This is my decision," Derek declared, his voice cutting through the whispers. "Officer Kirk has been immediately suspended, and an internal investigation has been launched. We will not tolerate actions that compromise the honor and responsibility of this department." Manning stepped forward again, this time more confrontational. "Chief Hayes, I'm not excusing what Kirk did, but he's a skilled officer. Are we really going to ruin his career over one mistake? He served for over 20 years. Maybe it was just a lapse in judgment." Derek met Manning's gaze unflinchingly. "A lapse in judgment can cost an innocent life," he said, his tone unyielding. "You call it a mistake. I call it a danger. If anyone on this team believes they can act without consequences, they don't belong here." "You call it a mistake. I call it a danger," Derek Hayes said firmly, his voice cutting through the silence in the room. "If anyone in this team believes they can act that way without consequences, they have no place in the Riversedge Police Department." The tension thickened, but this time, no one dared to respond. Derek exhaled deeply, letting his gaze sweep across the room, meeting the eyes of each officer. "I'm not here to fight with you," he continued. "I'm here to do what's right. We cannot change Riversedge's past, but we can decide how we act moving forward." Turning to Officer Miguel Torres, who stood nearby, Derek instructed, "Torres, I want a full report on this morning's incident on my desk by the end of the day. We'll handle this transparently." Torres nodded, visibly relieved by Derek's balanced firmness. John Manning, however, remained silent, his displeasure evident as he retreated into the crowd. Derek ended the meeting with a resolute final note. "If any of you feel you can't work under my leadership, I won't force you to stay. But remember this, we are not just enforcers of the law, we are representatives of justice. And justice has no room for prejudice, abuse of power, or weak excuses." He walked out of the briefing room, leaving a palpable silence in his wake. Some officers exchanged uncertain glances, while others bowed their heads in quiet reflection. Derek knew he had planted the seeds for change, but he also understood this was just the beginning. Immediately after the meeting, Derek officially ordered an internal investigation into Officer Alan Kirk's behavior. The investigation was entrusted to an independent team within the department, led by Torres, who had witnessed the incident firsthand. Derek emphasized that the inquiry's purpose was not only to address Kirk's actions, but to send a clear message about accountability and transparency. Over the following days, tensions within the Riversedge Police Department ran high. The investigation quickly unearthed troubling evidence, including video footage recorded by Lily, the bystander who had witnessed the morning's confrontation. However, what shocked the investigative team even more was Kirk's record. The files revealed that the incident was far from isolated. Kirk, a veteran officer with over 20 years of service, had a long history of complaints for excessive force and discriminatory behavior. Many of these complaints had been dismissed in the past, either due to a lack of evidence or a desire to protect the department's reputation. One glaring example was a case 3 years earlier in which Kirk had unjustly detained a black schoolteacher. The man was held for 24 hours without cause, only to be released without an apology or explanation. Such incidents painted a deeply troubling picture of Kirk's repeated abuses of power. When the investigative team interviewed Kirk, he vehemently denied the allegations, insisting that the morning's events were a misunderstanding. "I didn't realize he was the chief," Kirk said defensively, his voice strained. "I was just following procedure. Riversedge isn't the safest place, and who wouldn't be suspicious of a stranger in a fancy car?" Torres, seated across from Kirk, fixed him with a steely gaze. "You call pointing a gun at someone without cause procedure?" He retorted, his voice heavy with sarcasm. "And I don't think our procedures include insulting people based on personal bias." Kirk swallowed hard, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for support, but this time there was none to be found. Desperate to save himself, Kirk began leveraging personal connections in an attempt to exert pressure on the investigative team. He met privately with Manning, hoping to find an ally. "John, we've worked together for over 15 years, Kirk pleaded. "You know I'm not that kind of person. Help me explain this to the team. It's just a misunderstanding." Manning, though sympathetic, appeared uneasy. "Alan, I understand you're trying to defend yourself, but this is more serious than you think. They have video evidence, and Chief Hayes isn't going to let this slide." Failing to gain Manning's support, Kirk reached out to other connections, including a retired senior officer who had mentored him. "We can't let this ruin my career," Kirk implored over the phone, his voice laced with desperation. "You know how hard I've worked. Please, talk to the chief." But none of Kirk's efforts bore fruit. Bolstered by the investigative team's findings, Derek stood firm. Anyone who attempts to interfere with this investigation will face the same consequences, he declared. I don't care about past relationships or personal ties. Justice makes no exceptions. After 2 weeks of meticulous investigation, the team finalized its report. The conclusion was unequivocal. Alan Kirk had not only acted in a discriminatory manner, but had a documented history of abusing his authority. The evidence was irrefutable, and the team recommended his immediate dismissal. In his office, Derek read through the report in silence, feeling the full weight of the decision he was about to make. Once he finished, he set the file down and gazed out the window, where sunlight filtered through the trees. He knew that dismissing Kirk would send shockwaves through the department and the community, but he also understood that this was the only path forward if Riversedge was to heal and rebuild trust. Derek Hayes sat in his office, sunlight streaming in through the window as he reviewed the investigation's final report. The findings were conclusive, and he knew the decision he was about to announce would not only end Alan Kirk's career but also profoundly impact how the Riversedge community viewed its police force. With a steady hand, he picked up the phone. "Taurus," Derek said firmly, "schedule a full department meeting for tomorrow morning. I want this decision communicated to everyone." "Yes, Chief," Taurus replied, his tone confident yet measured. As he hung up the phone, Derek leaned back in his chair, the weight of leadership pressing heavily on his shoulders. The investigation's conclusion was only the first step in a long journey to reform the department's culture. The challenges ahead were daunting, but Derek was resolute. Justice, to him, was more than a duty. It was a sacred responsibility he refused to shirk. The next morning, the entire Riversedge Police Department gathered in the main conference room. A tense atmosphere hung in the air as Derek entered, the final report in hand. Every eye turned to him, some filled with hope, others clouded with skepticism. Derek approached the podium, standing tall as he swept his gaze across the room. He began in a steady voice. "First, I want to thank the investigative team for their professionalism and transparency. Their work has brought the facts into clear focus." Placing the report on the podium, Derek continued, his voice firm. "Officer Alan Kirk has committed serious ethical violations and abused his authority. This was not an isolated incident, nor a simple error in judgment. After careful consideration, I have decided that he will be terminated, effective immediately, with no opportunity to return to the Riversedge Police Department." A wave of murmurs rippled through the room. Some officers nodded in agreement, while others exchanged uncomfortable or disgruntled glances. From the corner, John Manning stood with arms crossed, his displeasure clear, though he remained silent. Derek raised a hand to quiet the room. "I understand this decision may be controversial," he said, his voice calm but commanding. "But I want you to remember this. Abuse of power not only harms the individuals involved, but it also erodes the trust our community places in us. If we cannot hold ourselves accountable, we do not deserve to serve as representatives of justice." Following the meeting, an official announcement of Kirk's termination was released to the public. In the statement, Derek emphasized that the decision was not personal, but a stand against misconduct. "No one is above the law," he declared, "and any abuse of power will face strict consequences." The community's response was swift and divided. On one side, many, particularly those who had experienced police misconduct firsthand, praised Derek's decision as a bold and necessary move. "Finally, someone brave enough to take a stand," said a local black resident during a televised interview. "We've waited too long for this. Chief Hayes is exactly what Riversedge needs." But not everyone was supportive. A vocal faction, including some retired officers and conservative residents, criticized the decision as excessive and unfair. Kirk was a veteran officer, one supporter declared on a local radio program. Now his entire career is ruined over one incident. It's unjust. Within days, tensions boiled over. Outside the police department, two opposing groups of protesters gathered. One group held signs reading, "Justice for All," chanting slogans in support of Derek's reforms. The other group carried banners demanding Kirk's reinstatement, accusing Derek of destroying the police force. From his office window, Derek watched the protests with a contemplative expression. This was not the outcome he had hoped for, but he knew meaningful change often came with resistance. Below, the two groups began engaging in heated arguments, some escalating into minor scuffles. Police officers stepped in to maintain order, following Derek's strict instructions. No use of force unless absolutely necessary. We must not escalate the situation. That evening, Derek held a press conference to address the growing tension. Reporters fired relentless questions, some accusatory in tone. "Chief Hayes, do you think your decision has divided Riversedge rather than united it?" one asked. Derek looked directly at the reporter and replied with calm determination. "Sometimes, to heal, we must first remove what has decayed. This is not division. It's the first step toward rebuilding trust. I didn't make this decision to please everyone. I made it because it was the right thing to do." As the press conference concluded, Derek returned to his office, the weight of the day's events settling heavily on him. He knew people like Kirk had no place in the department, and if Riversedge were to move forward, such changes were inevitable. Despite the ongoing tension, Derek remained steadfast. The road ahead was long, but he believed in the path he had chosen. Justice was never easy, but it was always worth it. Signs of progress began to surface in Riversedge. Community members, especially those from marginalized groups, started expressing renewed hope in the police department. One resident emailed Derek Hayes, writing, "Chief Hayes, I never thought I'd trust the police, but today I feel a glimmer of hope." Derek read the email and allowed himself a small smile. If even one person feels the change, that's a victory, he thought. He knew the journey ahead would be long and fraught with obstacles, but he was ready to keep fighting for Riversedge, for justice, and for the values he believed in. After announcing the decision to terminate Alan Kirk, Derek realized that one action alone would not be enough to transform the department's deeply rooted culture. To rebuild trust with the community, he had to start from within, ensuring his officers truly understood responsibility, bias, and the weight of their authority. At the weekly full staff meeting, Derek entered the room carrying a folder of materials. As he stepped up to the podium, he surveyed the room. Many faces were familiar from previous meetings. Some officers appeared calm and receptive, but others, particularly veteran officers like John Manning and his group, wore guarded expressions. Derek set the folder on the table and began, his tone deliberate. "I want all of you to understand something. Alan Kirk's case was not an isolated incident. It was a symptom of a deeper problem, one that's been festering in this department for far too long. If we don't address it, Riversedge will never move forward." He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. "Starting next week, every officer, regardless of rank or experience, will participate in a mandatory training course on bias awareness and elimination. This isn't just about understanding the community we serve, it's about examining our own actions and attitudes." Murmurs erupted across the room as officers turned to whisper to one another. A few openly displayed their dissatisfaction. John Manning, ever the spokesperson for the skeptics, stood up. His tone was calm but challenging. "Chief Hayes, with all due respect, I don't think this is necessary. We've worked in this field for decades. We know our community better than any training could teach us." Derek turned to face Manning, his expression steady and unwavering. "You think so, Manning? Then why are we here today discussing an officer who abused his authority for over 20 years without anyone stopping him? And how many times have we ignored similar behavior because we didn't think it was our problem?" The room fell silent as Derek's gaze shifted to meet each officer's eyes. "This isn't an accusation," Derek continued, his tone softening slightly. "This is an opportunity to do better, to become the protectors of justice that our community needs." The following week, the bias awareness training began at a local community center. Officers attended in small groups to encourage engagement and discussion. Initially, the atmosphere was tense. Many officers, particularly Manning's group, were dismissive of the training. "This is a waste of time," one officer muttered to a colleague as the trainer entered the room. "We have more important things to do." But as the sessions progressed, attitudes began to shift. Maria Flores, an officer with nearly a decade of service, stood to share her story. "Throughout my career, I've faced constant belittlement simply because I'm a woman," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "Colleagues doubted my abilities, mocked my suggestions, and even told me I didn't belong in this profession. But I stayed, and I proved them wrong. And I believe that if we truly want to serve our community, we have to start dismantling the prejudices we carry, not just against the public, but within our own ranks. Maria's story left many officers speechless. Some averted their eyes, visibly uncomfortable, while others appeared reflective. Next, Officer Terrence Banks, one of the youngest members of the force, spoke up. "When I joined the department, I thought I'd left behind the biases I grew up facing," he said. "But I hadn't. People here assumed I was hired just to fill a diversity quota. It made me feel like I had to work twice as hard just to be seen as competent." Stories like Maria's and Terrence's opened the door to deeper conversations. Officers were encouraged to share their own experiences and reflect on the challenges their colleagues faced. Even the staunchest skeptics, like John Manning, began to engage more openly. During one discussion, Manning surprised the group by admitting, "I've been here over 20 years, and I always thought I knew how to do this job. But hearing these stories, I realize now that I may have overlooked things I shouldn't have. Maybe I need to change too." Manning's admission marked a significant turning point. As the training sessions concluded, the atmosphere within the Riversedge Police Department began to shift. Officers communicated more openly, and underlying prejudices started to diminish. Maria Flores, who had once felt isolated, found a growing network of support among her peers. Terrence Banks noticed a change too, with colleagues who had previously kept their distance now treating him with newfound respect. Derek Hayes observed the subtle yet meaningful changes among his officers. Colleagues who had previously kept their distance from one another now shared conversations, nods of respect, and even laughter. These shifts, though small, reinforced Derek's belief that change was possible. At the end of the day, he jotted a note in his journal. "To change a community, we must first change ourselves." Riversedge is on the right path. As night fell over Riversedge, Derek sat alone in his office. The soft glow of his desk lamp illuminated the thoughtful lines on his face. The station had grown quiet, the echoes of officers' footsteps fading into stillness. Though encouraged by the small signs of progress, Derek felt the weight of immense pressure settling heavily on his shoulders. Every decision, he knew, could trigger ripple effects. Some predictable, others unforeseen. At 9 p.m., he decided to call it a day and headed home, seeking the comfort of his family. Walking through the door, Derek was greeted by the comforting aroma of dinner and the soft sound of laughter drifting from the living room. The familiar warmth of home provided a sense of relief. In the living room, his son Marcus was laughing with his mother, Sophia. As always, Sophia's calm presence was like a steady anchor amid Derek's storm of responsibilities. Sophia looked up as Derek entered, her warm smile lifting some of the heaviness from his heart. "You're late," she teased gently, walking over to place a hand on his shoulder. "There's dinner on the table. Do you want something to eat?" Derek shook his head, offering a faint smile. "No, I'm okay, but I do need to talk to you." Sophia immediately understood. She turned to Marcus and said gently, yet firmly, "Marcus, why don't you head upstairs and finish your homework so your dad can have a little quiet time?" Marcus nodded, obediently patting his father's shoulder on the way out. "I'm proud of you, Dad." "You know that, right?" he said softly. Derek's smile deepened, fleeting but genuine. "Thanks, son. That means a lot." Sophia led Derek to the kitchen, poured him a glass of water, and sat down across from him. Her eyes were warm but serious as she said, "Tell me, Derek, what's wrong? You don't look okay." Derek leaned back in his chair and sighed deeply. "Sophia, sometimes I wonder if I'm doing the right thing. Every step I take seems to meet resistance. Some people in the department still don't accept me. The community is divided, and sometimes I feel like I'm fighting this battle alone." Sophia stayed silent, allowing Derek the space to continue. "I know change takes time, but the exhaustion isn't just from the work. It's from knowing that not everyone even wants to see things get better. And sometimes I'm afraid I won't have the strength to keep going." Sophia straightened in her chair, her eyes shining with the same determination that had drawn Derek to her years ago. "Derek, listen to me," she said, her voice both gentle and resolute. "Do you remember why you started this career?" Derek stayed quiet, his gaze falling to the table as though searching for the answer within himself. After a long pause, he finally said, "I do. I wanted to change what my father went through. I wanted to make Riversedge a place where Marcus could grow up without facing the things I did." Sophia reached across the table, squeezing Derek's hand tightly. "Then don't forget that. You didn't take this job to be liked or to gain everyone's approval. You took it because you believe in justice and change. And I know, no matter how hard it gets, you're not the kind of person who gives up." Her voice grew steadier as she continued. "Look at everything you've already overcome. The long nights, the times you worked from dawn until midnight, the sleepless nights filled with worry. But you rose above all of it. You went from a patrol officer to the chief of this department. That didn't happen by chance. You earned it, Derek, through hard work and perseverance. You've already proven you belong here." Derek looked up, his eyes warmer now but still carrying a trace of doubt. Sophia leaned in closer, her voice soft but firm. "Derek, Marcus and I believe in you. You're not fighting this battle alone, and there are people out there, in the department and in the community, who believe in you too. They need you to lead them through this. And if others push back, let them. They'll come around when they see how determined you are." Her words felt like a small flame rekindling within Derek, igniting his resolve. He thought back to the promises he had made to himself as a boy, watching his father endure injustice. "Thank you, Sophia," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know what I'd do without you." Sophia smiled, brushing her hand over his. "Don't forget it," she said playfully, her tone lightening. "Every challenge is just a test, and you, Derek Hayes, have always found a way to pass." As the night wore on, Derek sat with Sophia, drawing strength from her unwavering love and belief in him. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he also knew he wasn't alone. His family, Sophia and Marcus, were his greatest motivation, grounding him as he continued his relentless fight for justice and change. Before bed, Derek stood before the mirror in his room, studying his reflection. "Tomorrow is a new day," he whispered. "And I will keep going." In the dim light, his reflection wasn't just that of a man burdened by responsibility. It was the image of someone ready to keep fighting for justice and the principles he held dear. The next morning, Derek entered his office with a renewed sense of determination. The conversation with Sophia the night before had helped him rediscover his purpose and reignite his motivation. Though challenges loomed large, Derek was confident that the changes he was implementing were not in vain. The Riversedge community, long divided and disillusioned, was beginning to show subtle signs of healing. Derek's reforms, from removing officers who abused their authority, like Alan Kirk, to initiating mandatory training programs to combat bias, were starting to bear fruit. Over the past few weeks, the police force had made noticeable efforts to rebuild its image. Officers conducted patrols with friendlier attitudes and frequently attended community meetings to listen to residents' concerns and gather feedback. Gradually, the wary, distrustful glances that once greeted the police gave way to cautious optimism. Riversedge citizens, though still guarded, began to feel safer and more connected to the officers serving them. Local coffee shops, once hotbeds of gossip and frustration about the police, became venues for sharing more positive stories about the department's progress. One such story involved Thomas Green, a middle-aged man living on the outskirts of town. Years earlier, Thomas had lost all faith in law enforcement after witnessing his brother, a black truck driver, being unjustly stopped and roughly handled by an officer for driving through a neighborhood deemed off-limits. The memory of that incident left a deep scar, and Thomas avoided all interaction with the police for years. But everything changed one autumn evening. After finishing a late shift at the factory, Thomas was walking home when two strangers confronted him in a dimly lit alley. They demanded his wallet, and when he refused, the situation quickly turned hostile. Before the encounter escalated further, a police cruiser happened to pass by. Officer Maria Flores, who had recently completed the bias awareness training initiated by Derek, stepped out with a calm yet authoritative demeanor. "What's going on here?" she asked firmly. The two men, startled by her presence, tried to flee. Maria acted swiftly, managing to apprehend one of the suspects while her partner secured the area. Shaken but unharmed, Thomas stood in awe. "Thank you," he stammered, his voice trembling. "I didn't think the police would show up so quickly, or care." Maria smiled warmly, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "That's our job, to protect everyone, no matter who they are." Her sincerity struck a deep chord with Thomas. It had been years since he had felt safe in the presence of law enforcement. Following the incident, Maria continued to check in on him, visiting him a few times to ensure he was doing well. This genuine care and follow-through began to shift Thomas's perception of the police. Thomas's experience was not unique. Derek's reforms and the police force's efforts were creating ripples of positivity throughout the community. More residents, once hesitant or outright fearful, began attending public forums with the police to voice concerns and offer suggestions. At one such meeting, an elderly woman stood and addressed the room. "I used to avoid the police because I was scared of them," she said, her voice quivering with emotion. "But now, I feel like they're listening to us. Thank you, Chief Hayes, for leading Riversedge in the right direction." Sitting in the front row, Derek listened to her heartfelt words with a small, genuine smile. He knew there was still much work to be done, but moments like these reassured him that his efforts were making a difference. One evening, Derek received a letter from Thomas. "Dear Chief Hayes, I never thought I'd write a letter like this, but I want to thank you and your department for doing the right thing. That night, Officer Flores didn't just save me from harm, she saved me from the distrust and bitterness I've carried for so long. She reminded me that change is possible, and so is hope." Derek set the letter down on his desk, feeling a profound sense of validation. He knew real change wouldn't happen overnight, but with every story like Thomas's, he felt one step closer to his goal. Transforming Riversedge into a community that both the police and its citizens could be proud of. Looking out the window of his office, Derek watched as the streetlights glimmered in the evening air. Though significant challenges remained, he knew he was on the right path, and that was enough to keep him moving forward. A few days later, Derek received an urgent report from Torres. The document revealed that a group of officers, led by John Manning, was secretly opposing Derek's reforms. Their actions went beyond disagreement. They were actively spreading rumors to undermine Derek's credibility. "Chief," Torres began gravely, "this group is creating more than friction. They're deliberately sabotaging progress." Derek's face hardened. He had expected resistance, but not to this extent. "Chief, I've learned that Manning has been holding private meetings with some veteran officers," Miguel Torres said in a grave tone. "They're planning to pressure you into resigning." Derek Hayes sat silently for a long moment, his expression darkening as he absorbed the news. Finally, he replied, his voice low but firm, "Thank you, Torres. I need to know everything they're doing. I'll handle this myself." Through Torres and other reliable sources, Derek quickly uncovered Manning's plans. The group wasn't merely spreading rumors that Derek was destroying the department's culture. They were actively delaying critical tasks, creating an illusion of chaos under his leadership. Worse, they had begun exaggerating minor issues to paint Derek as a leader incapable of managing his team. One member of the group even leaked false information about an internal matter, prompting local media to question Derek's competence. Derek knew the situation had to end, and the only way to resolve it was to confront John Manning directly. One afternoon, as the station quieted for the day, Derek summoned Manning to his office. The atmosphere was charged with tension the moment Manning entered, his eyes filled with defiance. "Manning, I know what you're doing," Derek began, his voice calm yet commanding, "and I think it's time we have an honest conversation." Manning crossed his arms, a smirk tugging at his lips. "An honest conversation, Chief? I'm just doing my job. If there's an issue, maybe you should take a closer look at your leadership." Derek's gaze remained cold and steady, unshaken by Manning's sarcasm. "Don't play coy, Manning. I know you're trying to undermine me and sabotage the reforms I'm implementing. Did you think your actions would go unnoticed?" Manning raised an eyebrow, his expression carefully controlled. "I'm not sure what you're talking about, but if you think I disagree with some of your decisions, you're right, and I'm not the only one." "You have the right to disagree," Derek said, his eyes narrowing. But you don't have the right to sabotage. This isn't a game, Manning. It's about the trust of this community and doing what's right. You're playing a dangerous game, and let me be clear, no one is above accountability. Not even you. Manning said nothing, his hands clenching at his sides. Derek's tone sharpened as he continued. If you think your actions will force me to step down, you're mistaken. I'm here for Riversedge, for the people who have endured far too much injustice, and I won't let anyone, not even you, stand in the way of that. After the confrontation, Derek didn't stop at issuing a warning. He called a department-wide meeting and publicly addressed the issue of sabotage. I know that some among us disagree with the changes being made, Derek said, his voice steady as he faced the crowd. But if you choose to undermine instead of engaging in dialogue, you have no place in this force. He then announced a comprehensive performance review for all officers, sending a clear message that accountability applied to everyone. The review uncovered troubling misconduct among several members of Manning's group, including falsified reports and deliberate delays in completing tasks. These officers were immediately suspended, pending further investigation. Though Manning himself wasn't directly implicated, the growing pressure began to erode his support within the department. Many officers started to realize that opposing Derek's leadership was not only risky, but also damaging to the community's trust in the police force. A week later, Manning walked into Derek's office, his demeanor noticeably different. The defiance in his eyes was gone, replaced by a subdued expression. "Chief," Manning began slowly, "I want to apologize for my actions. I let my personal feelings cloud my judgment. I won't stand in your way any longer." Derek studied Manning for a long moment before nodding. "Your apology is accepted, Manning. But I'll be watching your actions closely from now on. This isn't about you or me. It's about serving the community." After Manning left, Derek stood by his office window, watching the sunlight bathe the streets of Riversedge. He knew resistance wouldn't disappear overnight, but the way he handled the situation had sent a clear message. No one, regardless of rank, was above accountability. Riversedge was changing, and Derek was committed to ensuring that progress stayed on course. That morning, Derek stepped into the press room at the Riversedge Police Department. Sunlight streamed through the large windows, filling the space with warmth and hope. As reporters, citizens, and officers filled the room, Derek stood at the podium, scanning the crowd until his eyes landed on a few familiar faces, those who had supported him through the department's recent trials. "Ladies and gentlemen," Derek began, his voice steady and resonant, "today, I stand before you not to celebrate achievements, but to share the lessons we've learned. Riversedge has been on a long and difficult journey, not just this police department, but our entire community." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in before continuing. "This journey has taught me that change requires patience, courage, and above all, the collective will of everyone involved. Yes, we've faced setbacks. Yes, we've encountered resistance. But from those challenges, we found strength to rise and do what's right. It's been a difficult journey, not just for this police force, but for our entire community," Derek Hayes said, pausing to let his words resonate with the room. He continued, his tone steady but resolute. "Over the past months, I've learned something vital. Change is never easy. It requires patience, courage, and most importantly, the collective will of everyone involved. We've faced setbacks and resistance, but from those challenges, we've found the strength to rise and do what's right." Derek turned his gaze toward a group of citizens seated in the front row. "I know trust is hard to rebuild, especially when it's been broken for so many years. But I promise you this, we, the Riversedge Police Department, will not stop working to prove that we are worthy of that trust." He shared personal insights from his experience, emphasizing the importance of humility and accountability. "I've realized that no one is perfect, not even those of us in uniform. Our job isn't just to enforce the law, but to listen, learn, and correct our mistakes." To illustrate his point, Derek recounted the story of Thomas Green, a man who had regained faith in law enforcement after Officer Maria Flores stepped in to help him. "Thomas isn't just an individual story," Derek said. "He represents what we're striving for, a community that feels safe, respected, and protected." Derek didn't shy away from addressing internal challenges. Change hasn't been confined to the community. It's happening within this department. We face deep-rooted issues, from personal biases to resistance against reform. But by confronting these problems instead of avoiding them, we've begun laying a stronger foundation for the future. His voice grew more determined as he concluded, "This journey is far from over, it's just beginning. But one thing I'm certain of is that Riversedge is heading in the right direction. We cannot change the past, but we can shape the future." Ending his speech with a poignant message, Derek said, "This isn't my journey alone or the journey of the police force. It's the journey of the entire Riversedge community. And if we stand together, there's nothing we cannot achieve." After the press conference, Derek stood outside the station, watching as people dispersed. Some approached him to shake his hand and thank him, while others kept their distance, still wary. Derek understood that true change would take time, but he wasn't discouraged. As the sun set, Derek returned to his office, where the weight of unfinished work awaited him. Sitting at his desk, he thought back to Sophia's words. "You didn't start this journey to please everyone. You started it to do the right thing." In the quiet of his office, Derek thought to himself, "Doing the right thing is always worth it." The next day dawned, bringing new challenges and opportunities. Derek Hayes, though weary, was ready to continue his journey. A journey incomplete, but filled with hope. Derek's story serves as a powerful reminder that change is never easy, but always worth the effort. If you were in Derek's position, would you have the courage to stand up and face challenges for a greater cause? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share this story with your friends, and subscribe to stay updated on more meaningful content. Thank you for being part of this journey.